In yesterday's entry, I asserted that I would be able to find, if I had to, 20 or 25 examples of Mathew Franklin Whittier purposely arranging for several of his pieces, or at least two anyway, sometimes more, to be juxtaposed on the page. Sometimes he would have a poem that was either his or one that he particularly liked directly above a piece that he wrote under one of his many pseudonyms. And the poem would tell you some secret about what the article was really about. Or sometimes it was just a tribute to his late wife, Abby. But more often there was some interconnection between the two. Then he might put one off to the side or one underneath. Now, I'm going to give you some examples. That's not an easy thing to search for in my database. And the reason for that is that I can search on keywords, but I hadn't noted down, it's my bad, but I hadn't noted down where all these juxtapositions took place so that I would have them all in, one folder. What I did was to mention them in the body of my books. So mainly, other than just my own memory, the best way to find them was to get into my books and search on keywords like directly above or immediately below or just to the side or something like that. Well, doing that, I have come up with 7 examples. And the reason these are important, or one of the reasons they're important, is that this forms the basis for some of my evidence, not all, that Mathew was the real author of The Raven, which was stolen from him or falsely claimed by Edgar Allan Poe. And if anyone looks at these, and especially someone who's skeptical looks at these, the automatic answer is that it's just a coincidence. There's other normal explanations that don't involve the explanation I'm giving, but there's other reasons to believe that I'm correct. So I thought I'd go over some of these things logically, the pros and cons, and then I'll share with you these 7 examples. The last example bears directly on The Raven and Edgar Allan Poe. It's not one that, as my upcoming article is currently written, that I've included. So this is another piece of evidence that isn't in the paper. There's so much evidence that I couldn't fit it all in that paper. I might decide to stick it in. I'm not sure at this point. The paper reads pretty well as it is. I mean, it's a done deal many times over. So, how much evidence is enough evidence? And, if someone's not just flat out going into denial, basically it's proven. So let's look at some of these logical points. I don't have them written down. I think I've got them pretty much from memory, or let's just kind of examine them together. The first one is chance. Well, there's too many examples and they're too on point for chance. I have 7. There's several that I left out because they're part of the evidence for The Raven. So I could immediately find maybe 8 or 9 or 10 of these things, but I know there's at least twice as many. So I think we're at least up to 20. And they're very specific, some of them, if you know what you're looking for. And I know all of Mathew's personal history and, as I've said a million times, 2,300 of his published works. So I know what I'm looking for. So I think chance is off the table. There's another explanation, and that is that the editor saw fit to put these things together, and it had nothing to do with Mathew requesting it, which is to say, if Mathew writes about grief or some aspect of grief, the editor might have said, oh, we've got this poem that has to do with grief. That'll look nice above that article. So it could just be the editors, but some of these things have to do with Mathew revealing secrets about himself and his relationship with Abby that only I knew, which is to say I'd extrapolated it already from a great many clues that Mathew had left in his life story and in his works, but it wasn't generally known, and it probably would not have been known to the editor, at least most of the editors. One of them he was close friends with might have known these things. So I think that explanation is off the table, at least as regards all of them. Then there's the possibility that Mathew simply sent in his works together, or even other things by other people that he liked, because he knew these editors personally. So he might have sent in 2 of his own pieces, and then he said, by the way, you might want to print this. This is a nice poem by somebody. It might have meant something to him personally, but he might not have told the editor Specifically, would you please put this directly above my work? See? And it could have ended up together because the typesetter could have literally been working off a stack where, everybody's envelope was in a stack. And when he got to Matthew's envelope, all these, 3, 4 different pieces were together. And the typesetter, being kind of lazy, just put them all together on the page. That's possible. Even with that, some of these are so tightly intertwined in terms of their meaning, so specific, that even if Matthew didn't specifically request it, he could have sent them in the same envelope, hoping that they would end up together, see? So those are the normal explanations. And I have to say here that a skeptic, the way his mind works, I don't know, it's like if you stub your toe, the whole universe for you boils down to this one piece of anatomy. It's toe, 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 and that's the only thing that's going on with you, basically. You don't see the fingers, you don't see the other toes, you don't see the, the piece of furniture or anything except maybe if it was the thing you hit your toe on, You don't see the ant crawling down there. You don't see the flower. You don't see anything. It's just your toe, see? So skeptics' minds are distorted in this way because they have an agenda. They have an emotional agenda, probably defending their paradigm, which is big. It's like defending your country, whatever. So they're defending their paradigm, and it distorts their perception, and that's why they come up with some of these illogical explanations. Well, that's why these explanations I've just given, these normal ones, are going to loom large for a skeptic, and it gives the impression, the subjective impression, that they have more logical weight. Well, actually, they don't have more logical weight. They have more weight in his universe because he's defending his paradigm, and it's scary, and it hurts. See, if there's a threat. So that magnifies these normal explanations and seems to give them more credibility than they actually have. On the other hand, I have a bias, obviously. I want these things to be Matthew's. I'm also very strongly dedicated to the truth. And if I am really convinced that I'm mistaken, I will admit it, as I recently admitted and demonstrated. I'm not as, how can I put this? I'm not as strongly influenced by my biases as the skeptics are influenced by theirs. However, I do have my biases and I do feel it. See, I've got my paradigm and I feel the urge to defend my paradigm. But I have also reasons to come to the conclusions that I have that the viewer doesn't have. Again, I've got all of this huge body of work that I have studied of Matthew's. I've seen with my own eyes this phenomenon of Matthew's work being stacked on a page and being meaningful in their interrelations many times, more times than I can come up with examples for here. I know how his mind works. I know that he was secretive. I know that he embedded secret messages, either just for himself or for people who might be in the know or for posterity. I think he was very concerned with telling posterity that he had actually been the author of some of these things and revealing, or at least recording, some of the secrets about his relationship with Abby. As a matter of fact, it seems to me that he actually told the whole deep, intimate story of his relationship with Abby in these clues, embedded all the way through all of these pieces that he published. And in fact, I was able to write a novel, which is mostly derived from those clues, which you can find in my store. So I have reasons to believe that I'm correct about this based on information that other people don't have. And there's where it comes to credibility, because if I was a famous scholar or a famous figure who had published a great many books and received a great many awards, people would trust me on the basis of my credentials. But I'm the opposite. I have no credentials. I have negative credentials, basically. So as a result, anything I say is suspect, and more likely dismissed than not, So, keep that in mind, because that's also a bias, So let's get into some of these examples. Some of them I have physical antiquarian copies of, and some I don't. Where I don't, I'm going to use my Kindle. Where I have them, I'm going to pick them up and read from the originals. This one I do not have a physical copy of. I have a photograph copy of that my researcher took. I have an excellent researcher, by the way, friend and researcher, who has done yeoman's work in this. Now, here's the chronotype, September 26th, 1846. The Boston Chronotype was a radical abolitionist newspaper, which was published by his friend, a friend of both the Whittier brothers, John Greenleaf Whittier and Mathew, named Elijah Wright. He was very progressive, and Mathew could write just about anything he wanted for Elijah Wright and get it in. Now here we have, in the September 23, 1846 edition, we have a poem which by style and subject I identified as Mathew's work. It's called Stanzas Written at Midnight. It's basically written, he had insomnia, and he's written several times about cats caterwauling at night and keeping him awake. There's at least 3 poems I know of that he wrote that I can pretty definitely attribute to him. This is unsigned, but by style and by subject, I'm saying this is definitely Mathew Franklin Whittier. It begins, I think I can read it here. When the nightly dews down falling moisten all the sheds around, fearful is the caterwauling, echoing through the dark profound. Now it's really tough to read. I can put it on the screen and it'd be obvious and easy to read, but on my Kindle it's pretty tough. So I'm going to let that be for now. Now, directly below this poem is a letter from Ethan Spike from Hornby, and this is the one character that Mathew is historically known to have written. So there's no question whatsoever that Mathew was the author. And I'll put a little image of that up on the screen. But basically we have Mathew's unsigned poem about insomnia and cats caterwauling at night. And then we have this letter from Ethan Spike immediately below. I don't want to go too much into each one of these, but that's just our first example. Now, whether that was put there by Elijah Wright, by the typesetter, or what, I don't know. I don't know that the subject of one has anything to do with the subject of another. It's just the same author. Okay, the next one is from the Boston Weekly Museum. This is the November 16, 1850 edition. This is the one that I found by quote-unquote accident. It was for sale with another edition of the Weekly Museum on eBay, and I bought the 2 old ratty editions. I couldn't find anything by Mathew, and I was about ready to resell them, and I was photographing them to resell them when I noticed on the back a story signed Quails, and I recognized it as Mathew's style. Well, that led me on a long, long chase, because Quails normally is a travelogue. This is a story. This was written during a point when Mathew, who apparently was traveling the New England states as a postal inspector, was on a layoff for an extended period of time. And during that time, instead of submitting travelogue entries after writing a couple things about things going on in Boston, where he had his home base, he sent these sketches. Now, first of all, these sketches are absolutely identical in style with the ones that were stolen from him by Francis Durivage and George Burnham. So if you're into style analysis, I'm talking for people now or in the future, if you're big on style analysis, I would suggest comparing these sketches signed Quails with the ones that Francis Durivage and George Burnham stole and published under the pseudonyms The Olden and The Young'un. You'll find it's absolutely identical. This one is called How the Cows Were Won. And I recognized from Mathew's style that this story was actually about a period when Mathew and Abby had lived in Methuen, Massachusetts for about a month after their son Joseph had died of scarlet fever. And I traced things from there. There's a long backstory about that. A psychic medium told me. He gave Mathew's name, Mathew, and then, as near as I could make it out, the word Methuen. So before I ever found this article, I knew from the psychic medium that Matthew and Abby had apparently lived in Methuen, Massachusetts, and this confirmed it. But there was this thing in the way, and that is that scholars believed that an entertainer named Ashen Dodge had written the entire Quails travelogue. I had to disprove that before I could prove that the psychic gave my past life name along with the name of a town which Matthew and Abby had lived in and that I had never heard of. See, it took me quite a long time, and there's a huge chunk of my first book devoted to proving that Quails was Mathew Franklin Whittier and not Ashen Dodge. It's a long story. It was a conspiracy between Dodge and the editor. They conspired to pretend that Dodge was the author of this travelogue, and Matthew went along with it, joked along with it, but he left some pretty broad clues that he was really the author. Now, I'm going to take $2 store pillows because this is a huge volume here, and I'm going to look for the November 16, 1850 edition of Quails. This is what this volume looks like. It's huge and not in real good shape. I had the 50 and the 51, and this 50 is pretty ratty. I mean, the pages are in good shape, but the spine is suffering. So here we are on the back page of this edition, and I'm going to bring my light down a little bit. This I can actually read. It's How the Cows Were Won, or Who Was the Laziest Man, an item from real life. Matthew wrote from real life, and he would very often say that it was from real life. That's one clue that it's Matthew's work. It's very broadly from real life. It's a long story, but I can feel it and I can figure it out. He's talking about two very lazy people from different counties in Massachusetts, Essex County, and I think one other one. He doesn't name them. He gives the first letters. And these people were so lazy that there was a contest to see who was the laziest. And the lazier one won the contest because he was so lazy he couldn't be bothered to tell anybody why he was the laziest one. He just couldn't get it out. And so he won the contest and the two cows that were put up as the prize. Well, I don't have any proof of this, but I'll tell you what's going on here. They had just lost their son, Joseph, their 11-month-old son, and it devastated them. And it devastated Abby to the point that Matthew was afraid she was going to throw herself in the river. And he didn't dare leave her alone. So he would walk with her along the river. They apparently were taken in by Matthew's second cousin, Richard Whittier. That is now the Tenny Gatehouse, which is also the Historical Society in Methuen, which I've been to, and I felt a very strong past life hit when I got into the smaller bedroom upstairs. So that's where they were. I think that's where they started writing A Christmas Carol. A picture of that bedroom is in my paper. But this talks about them being in Methuen, and I think the townspeople were so mean that they accused Matthew and Abby of being lazy because they didn't work. Matthew couldn't work. Even if he could make himself work, he had to be with Abby because he was terrified that she was going to throw herself in the river and drown herself. That's what I feel, and it makes perfect sense. So Matthew got back at all these people years after Abby died in 1841. Here it is, 1850. He knows that those people will recognize themselves. They will know what he's writing about. Okay, nobody else will have any idea what this is. So it's a satirical jab at the people that dared to accuse him and Abby of being lazy when they just lost their son. See, back then, losing a child was not that uncommon, and for the more worldly people, it was not that big a deal. To them, it was the world had fallen in, because I think this was a precocious child and he was absolutely precious to them. I have no feelings about it whatsoever. I blocked the whole thing emotionally. If I had a past life regression and touched into that, I think it'd be quite a tsunami, but I haven't. There's a poem about Joseph that was plagiarized by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She published it twice, actually. First time it's called A Dream. I think it's published in 1840 in Finden's Tableau, and then it's called A Child Asleep in her 1844 compilation. That's Matthew's poem about little Joseph sleeping. So right directly above this is a poem by Mrs. Sigourney, Mrs. L.H. Sigourney, who I think was one of Abby's favorites, if I'm not mistaken, and certainly one of Matthew's. And it's called The Swedish Songstress and Her Charities. This is about Jenny Lind, the famous Swedish singer who came to America. And Matthew writes about how profoundly he was affected by her singing. But this is put there, I believe, because it reminds Matthew of how Abby used to sing. Now, if you read Lady Geraldine's Courtship, which was published in that same compilation by Elizabeth Barrett, the future Elizabeth Barrett Browning, you will find a mention of Lady Geraldine, who was really Abby when she was much younger than Lady Geraldine, out in nature where they were studying because she was tutoring him. And you will find that they break off from their studies and she breaks out in song. He says it's like a child's emotion and a god. And then he compares her to a naiad, which he many times talked about her as a naiad. So this poem, I think, reminded him of Abby singing. And he arranged for it to be above this story, which is about this incident in their life. You see how all these things tie together? I mean, if you understand Matthew's position and his mind, and that he was very secretive, but that these things, he was the kind of person that was very cool on the outside and you know, like a seething ocean on the inside with his feelings and his emotions, you know, and his perceptions. And that's the way his writing is. It looks like a joke on the outside. And it looks like a complete coincidence that this poem is sitting up on top. That's his secretive nature. You understand? And I can feel this because I still have this. See? All right, I'm going to read this poem. It's short. Blessed must their vocation be, who with tones of melody charm the discord and the strife and the railroad rush of life, and with Orphean magic move souls inert to life and love. But there's one who doth inherit angel gifts and angel spirit, bidding tides of gladness flow through the realms of want and woe, mid lone age and misery's lot, kindling pleasures long forgot, seeking minds oppressed with night, and on darkness shedding light. She the seraph's speech doth know, she hath done their deeds below. So when o'er these misty strands she shall clasp their waiting hands, they will fold her to their breast, more a sister than a guest. This is reprinted from the New York Morning Star, so it wasn't even written for this paper. Do you see how this when Matthew read that was Abby to him. He would many times speak of her as an angel or a water sprite or a mystical being, you know. This is not a coincidence. All right, let's move on. That's example number 2. Example number 3 is in the Portland transcript. We're going way back to June 11, 1842, which was a little over a year after Abby had died. This is the very first thing I have found that Matthew was able to write after Abby's death. It's short, it's about death, and I think it's a restatement of Abby's own philosophy, her own teaching. Let me get this light. There we go. So it's not quite in the picture there. I tend to make a mistake and the thing sits there. Excuse me. I tend to make mistakes and the thing sits there throughout the entire video. You know, I've done that several times. So I'm learning to kind of catch them. All right, here we are. This is the Portland transcript covering from March 25, 43. No, covering from October 23, 1841 to March 25, 1843. And we are turning to the June 11, 1842 edition. There it is. Now, this is one of those interesting examples where I didn't recognize it at first. I wasn't convinced. As a matter of fact, I decided that it probably was not Matthew's because I was trying to err on the side of caution. And I decided, oh, that's a coincidence. You know, it's a coincidence because I have my own skeptic, my own internal skeptics. And later I came back to it when I learned a little more about Matthew and Abby's life. And I realized that, of course, it's Matthew's. I was looking for a particular style, and this isn't written in that style. I didn't realize that Matthew did write in other styles, So this is titled To Abby. It's original, meaning that, it's original for the transcript. It's signed M. Now this is interesting because if this is Matthew, and I'm sure it is, it means that the historians who have assumed that Matthew liked to go by his nickname Frank for Franklin, that they're wrong. I knew they were wrong. As soon as I read that, it was like what I felt was that Matthew really liked Franklin and many times signed either F or sometimes Franklin because of its association with his namesake, Benjamin Franklin. But he hated Frank, and people would call him Frank, and he hated it. That means that this myth that the Whittier historians love to repeat came from his enemies. Most of the information about Matthew in the Whittier legacy came from his enemies, including Samuel Picard. So I felt that, but this basically proves it. Matthew would have signed with the initial that Abby knew him by. If she called him Frank, he would have signed F. So the fact that he signed M in a poem that was written to Abby, I believe while she was still alive, means that she had to have called him Matthew or Matt. She couldn't have called him Frank. In a letter to his sister, she calls him either MFW or Franklin. Matter of fact, she crosses out where she's about to put MFW and writes Franklin. That's for her. That's for the Whittier family. That wasn't what she would have called him. All right, so that's enough of that lecture. As near as I can tell, this is a period when Matthew was convalescing somewhere away from Matthew, where he couldn't visit her for several months. She had tuberculosis, consumption, and people would go to a warmer climate and convalesce, and that's what she was doing here. And he was writing to her. Apparently it had been some months now. He's at the end of May. It's signed from Bucksport, May 1840, but the poem says that it's at the end of May. So I think that probably in January or December of the previous year even, she had gone somewhere to a warmer climate. I think it was to her father's native Guadeloupe. And I think that Charles Poyen, who introduced mesmerism to America, did I say he was her first cousin? I think I did. I think that he was caring for her there in Guadeloupe and pretty much cured her, at least temporarily, because she did come back and bear their second child. So that's a long story, but this poem is to her grieving her absence for so many months. And I can read a little bit of it. I don't know if I should read the whole thing. He starts out, "Yes, May has almost gone, love, that month we loved so well, and our dear birds sing as sweetly, and the flowers in yonder dell e'en lift their timid heads to greet me, as if they thought that now I might forget the dark days since we parted long ago." And it goes on that he's expecting her to come back and that the flowers will bloom again. Well, that's clearly Matthew. Now, immediately below that is a story, unsigned, which is absolutely 100% flat out in Matthew's humorous sketch style, clearly from a personal recollection from his youth. It's called Let Go My Hair, and I'm tempted to read the whole thing. It's not very long. Let me read it. It's kind of funny. An old pastor once stated that in the whole course of 50 years preaching, he never laughed but 3 times in the pulpit during the holy exercise of the Sabbath. One of these 3 times was on the following occasion. The pews of the church were those old-fashioned square ones, so that the people in different pews often sat back to back, merely separated by a low railing or division. Now it fell out one Sabbath that 2 old deacons, Matthew very often poked fun at deacons and wrote about them, in 2 contiguous pews had fallen into 2 profound meditations and closed their twice 2 eyes and thrown their 2 heads back until their 2 occipits with their 2 long queues dangling therefrom had met together and were quietly reposing for the benefit of the aforesaid internal meditations. There were some wicked people present who scandalously insinuated that the two deacons were asleep, but I look upon it as a mere precaution for righteousness' sake. However, there was an awfully depraved young man in the third pew, this is Matthew, that cornered upon the two where the deacons were meditating. He's sitting next to them. And what does this sacrilegious sinner do? Why, he takes the two dangling cues aforesaid and softly ties them firmly and closely together. And then, as if that were not enough to send him to perdition, he takes a pin and cruelly sticks it into the sides of one of the deacons. Well, the deacon jumped, of course, like a stuck pig, and the jump gave a horrid twitch upon the two cues of both heads. "Let go my hair," cried deacon number one. "Let go my hair," cried deacon number two. 'Twas now twitch and twitch, hit and hit, but the denouement must be left to the reader's imagination. Clearly Matthew relating a story from his mischievous youth, and he was known to be rather mischievous as a kid, see? So that means that the poem To Abby, signed M, is definitely Matthew. That means that Abby did convalesce somewhere for several months. And it means that the story underneath is definitely his, a story from his young adulthood, see? Now, or earlier probably. Now, do these skeptical arguments hold up? If a skeptic says this is chance, this is coincidence, how well does that hold up? I don't think it holds up very well at all. I think clearly I'm correct about this one. That immediately opens up the likelihood that I'm correct about the other ones because it shows that he did this, okay? Either he or the editor on his own did this, but very likely Matthew put this below. Now, he was remarried at this point. It was an arranged marriage to a woman that he really couldn't love because he was still in love with Abby. So he didn't want to come right out. I mean, it's amazing that he signed this one. He didn't write this one at the time he was married, but he published it when he was married. And I think there was a defiant streak in Matthew that he didn't want to hurt his new wife's feelings, but sometimes his loyalty just absolutely was to Abby and not to her. And I think this was one of those instances where he just said, I'm just going to do this out of my love for Abby, Now, whether he should have or not, I don't know, but that's what's happened here. And fortunately for us, because definitely Matthew did use that technique. Now, I don't mean to be so adamant and forceful sometimes. It's just that in the future, people will say, boy, that's really overkill. I believe you already. But now it's a very different story, The fourth one is in the Portland Tribune. And this is a researcher taken, a different researcher, when I paid. He only took close-up shots of these things. He didn't shoot the whole page. And all I have is the close-up strips, which I do have in my Kindle. This is not long after Abby's death. I mean, we're still in the same year, so this is only like 5 months or a little less, just about 5 months after Abby died. He couldn't really write anything at this point. Even when it was his turn to write his F-signed piece for the Dial, which he was the F-signing writer, reviewer in the Dial and not Margaret Fuller, during this period, he couldn't write one. So he took something that he had written like 10 years earlier and submitted it. I've talked about that in an earlier entry. So here we have for the Portland Tribune, which means it's original, titled Death. And it's a little essay. I think this is Abby's teaching that Matthew has kind of either replicated or he literally took it from her writings, but I would guess that he is reiterating what he had learned from Abby. I know this is Matthew because it's signed with his star, his asterisk. So there's no question that this is Mathew Franklin Whittier's work. I've proven the asterisk 1,000 times over as Matthew's signature. So I'm going to read this. It's not very long. Death is the introduction to life. What we call life is but the preparation for this introduction, the preparation to life. We are here in the womb of our being, not yet struggled into the light of real, unfettered existence. When the freed soul enters the spiritual world, as we may with perfect reasonableness conceive, it will be filled with a delightful astonishment from the consciousness it will there have of its wonderful powers and their field of exercise. What a vast multitude will be there to greet it on its entrance. Were all the number of earth's inhabitants combined in one vast assembly, they would be but a mere handful in comparison with those, quote, legions of angels and, quote, that multitude which no man can number, redeemed and gathered from each successive generation. You see, Matthew does not believe in reincarnation at this point. He's embraced the spiritualist view. How delightful will be the greeting of long separated and dearly beloved friends. How many recognitions will there be? Death is naturally an object of terror, and in itself alone considered, it is so. We know not how the dying feel. We know not whether the parting struggle of the soul and body will be a pleasurable or painful separation. We know nothing of what will be the circumstances in any respect of our dying hour. But this we know, whenever death may call us, it will be unspeakable gain if we are faithful to the charge entrusted to us and have repaired to him who alone can present a sinner faultless before the throne of God, signed with a star. Okay, so that's definitely Matthew, and you can see his faith, which he sometimes struggled with, as you see in The Raven, which was not written by Edgar Allan Poe, but most of the time it held for him. This was written about 4 months before the occasion that The Raven talks about. So when someone dies, you have a certain period of grace, of shock, of emotional shock. But when that wears off, the whole thing hits you like a ton of bricks, and then your doubts gain the foreground. So this is August. In December, Matthew would be experiencing what he wrote about in The Raven and probably writing it about the same time. Above this poem is one by Mrs. Hemans. Now, I didn't look up Mrs. Hemans' full name, but definitely, as I understand, this was one of Abby's favorite poets, and she goes back to Abby's era. This is called The Memory of Joys That Are Past. Now, Abby was a musical prodigy. She would sing for Matthew, as I've said. You see it in Lady Geraldine's Courtship and a number of other places. She played piano. She may even have played the harp, unless that was just a reference to being in heaven. But she was an excellent musician. And she certainly would have sung for Matthew and played for Matthew. I even had one past life memory, very strong one about it. So this poem calls to his mind when he hears a song that Abby had played or sung for him. This is the effect on him, that it brings everything back. See, that's what this poem is about. And that's why Matthew has chosen to put this, to have this printed directly above his poem about death. I'm going to go ahead and read this. It's only 3 stanzas. There is a tear of sweet relief, a tear of rapture and of grief. The feeling heart alone can know what soft emotions bid it flow. It is when memory charms the mind with tender images refined. 'Tis when her magic spells restore departed friends and joys no more. There is an hour, a pensive hour, and oh, how dear its soothing power. It is when twilight spreads her veil and steals along the silent dale. 'Tis when the fading blossoms close, when all is silence and repose. Then memory wakes and loves to mourn the days that never can return. Now here's the last stanza that Matthew would have related to. There is a strain, a plaintive strain, the source of joy and yet of pain. It is the song whose dying measure some friend beloved has heard with pleasure, some friend who ne'er again may hear the melting lay to memory dear. Ah, then by magic spells restore visions of blissful days no more.
So that's another example, and I think it's a pretty darn strong one. I don't think there's any question, but first of all, that Matthew definitely wrote the essay on death, and secondly, that he arranged for that poem to be immediately above it. So you're seeing the pattern, and you're seeing the skeptical argument of normal explanations kind of melt, dissipate into the mist. They're just not going to hold up. In the Weekly Museum, the September 25, 1850 edition is an account of hiking for extended period of time through the country, signed Boots. Now, Matthew used this term, Boots, as a pseudonym, and the reasons he used it go back. There was a humorous instance that he writes about where he got too drunk and danced wildly at a party that Abby was at before they became a couple. And apparently his friend who had brought him to that party said, "Go it, Boots," and he became known as Boots, that he picked up that nickname. Boots, however, is also a name for a servant, the guy who shines your boots. When you get to the inn, the guy takes your boots and shines them or whatever. So he's the servant. So it has a double meaning. Matthew was friends with a wealthy young man, and he was the poor one. See, so he was Boots. He was this guy's servant, essentially, Now, when Matthew is traveling, this is in 1850, he goes back, as he often did, into his past and picks up this old nickname as his pseudonym because he's walking, in boots. And I could pretty much definitely say that this is during the period that he wrote the sketches as Quails, the same period of time when he was laid off for a month or two from his usual job as a postal inspector. See, so after he hangs around Boston for a while, writes a few reports about the theater or whatever in Boston, then he starts submitting these sketches, humorous sketches, which are just exactly like the ones that Durivage and Burnham stole. Then he decides to go on a hike. I don't know how many miles it was. It was pretty long. He's going to Dover, New Hampshire. Well, Dover, New Hampshire is where Matthew and Abby eloped to in 1836 and lived for about a year and a half. That was some of the happiest, although Matthew's business failed, I think they didn't care. They were so happy, like in Fiddler on the Roof, when he says they're so happy they don't know how miserable they are, something like that, the father says about his oldest daughter. It was like that, I think. That's what I feel. For one thing, they could have sex anytime they wanted because she was already pregnant, and that was the first time in their relationship that he didn't have to worry about being pregnant. So I don't think he really cared about the business. Anyway, Boots is Matthew. I mean, style-wise, there's quite a few entries, and it's really clear that that's Matthew. Now, let me get the physical copy of this here. I've got to bring my massive volume of 1850 Weekly Museum back up. This thing is something else, let me tell you. It's magnificent. I've never seen it since. This thing doesn't show up for sale anywhere. It's a miracle that I actually found it. Unbelievable. September 28th. Is that what I said? I said September 25. This is September 28th. Just to give you an idea what kind of company Matthew was in, to the right, on the next page, we have a story written for the Boston Weekly Museum, meaning it was original, called The Late Mrs. Bridges, or The Wife of Four Husbands, by Paul Creighton. Well, Paul Creighton was John Townsend Trowbridge, who Matthew became friends with in later years. Whether he was at this time or not, I don't know. But he's a major author. So this is the kind of company Matthew is keeping, literary company, that we've got John Townsend Trowbridge on the next page, original for the museum. Now, here's Boots's account. He says, beginning a story at Wolfboro and ending up at Dover is not approaching very directly the end of our journey. And he goes on like that. But he's ending up at Dover, New Hampshire, which is almost like a pilgrimage, is what I feel like. He's making a pilgrimage to the place where he and Abby were so happy for a little while. Directly above that this poem is by T. Westwood. I've written it wrong in my notes. It's called Voices at the Throne. And this, again, is about Abby and her singing. It's about a little child who's singing because it's so pure and so sincere, pleases God more than all the seraphs. You see the pattern? So this is how he conceives of Abby in heaven. Shall I read this? A little child, a little meek-faced, quiet village child, and Abby grew up in a little town, little town of Rocks Village, sat singing by her cottage door at eve, a low, sweet Sabbath song. No human ear caught the faint melody. No human eye beheld the upturned aspect, or the smile that wreathed her innocent lips the while they breathed the oft-repeated burden of the hymn, Praise God, praise God. A seraph by the throne in the full glory stood. With eager hand he smote the golden harp strings, till a flood of harmony on the celestial air welled forth unceasing. Then with a great voice he sang the Holy, Holy evermore, Lord God Almighty, and the eternal courts thrilled with the rapture, and the hierarchies, angels, and rapt archangel throbbed and burned with vehement adoration. Higher yet rose the majestic anthem, without pause, higher with rich magnificence of sound, to its full strength, and still the infinite heavens rang with the Holy, Holy evermore, till trembling from excess of awe and love, each sceptered spirit sank before the throne with a mute hallelujah. But even then, while the ecstatic song was at its height, stole in an alien voice, a voice that seemed to float upward from some world afar, a meek and childlike voice, faint, but how sweet, that blended with the seraph's rushing strain, even as a fountain's music with the roll of the reverberated thunder. Loving smiles lit up the beauty of each angel's face at that new utterance, smiles of joy that grew more joyous yet, as ever and anon was heard the simple burden of the hymn, Praise God, praise God. And when the seraph's song had reached its close, and o'er the golden lyre silence hung brooding, when the eternal courts rung but with echoes of his chant sublime, still through the abysmal space, that wandering voice came floating upward from its world afar, still murmured sweet on the celestial air, Praise God, praise God. That touched Matthew, and it immediately made him think of Abby in heaven, of Abby singing as a little girl, because he knew her when she was little. If you read Lady Geraldine's Courtship, which was really written by Matthew and not by Elizabeth Barrett, you will see that when Lady Geraldine, who is really Abby, breaks out in song, that she sings with a child's emotion in a god, like a naiad, tired of rest, I think the line is. It's the same. This was Abby as Matthew remembered her, and whenever he'd come across a line of poetry that touched him deeply and really reminded him of her, he would put it, or arrange to have it put, above one of his columns. These seem to have absolutely nothing to do with each other. This trip by Boots to Dover, so what's Dover? But the secret meaning to Matthew is that this was a pilgrimage to the place where they eloped to, where they were so happy. And this is Abby as he remembered her as a child. See? Now, this is not coincidence, okay? and I'm just sharing a fraction of what I've seen, see? Okay, so next in the Weekly Museum, we're going to, this is January 20, 1849. So I've introduced this before. This is the edition in which Matthew reviews one of Charles Dickens' Christmas stories, The Haunted Man, which was written, I think it was the last of the series, which was written after A Christmas Carol was published. And Matthew basically says, well, he probably dashed it off in a couple days. It's not bad. It has a moral, but he really should leave all of the mysticism and the occult to somebody like Bulwer Lytton, who knows what he's talking about. In other words, in A Christmas Carol, that aspect of A Christmas Carol was written by Abby. It was not Charles Dickens, and he needs to leave that alone because he's hopelessly incompetent to write about mysticism or the occult. It was an affront to Matthew that he claimed it, because basically, by writing these subsequent editions, Dickens was trying to prove that he had written all of A Christmas Carol, including Abby's work, which he had not. It's exactly like Edgar Allan Poe writing Eulalie to try to prove that he had written The Raven. And Eulalie is awful. Okay, so, but above this, I'm going to get my notes because I can't really read it. Above is a poem called The Neglected, translated from the German of Goethe by J.W. Hansen. That one is about walking in a field and seeing a flower, and the flower addresses him and says that even though it is lowly, it gets its strength from the earth, and so on. It's something that Matthew would have felt drawn to. Immediately to the right, however, is a story called The Dying Swan, from the German of Herder, who I'm not familiar with. And this is a story about a swan who sings before Apollo. I think, I haven't read the whole story, but I think its mate has died and is in heaven, and he sings before Apollo so beautifully that he dies and rejoins his mate in heaven. So it's pretty clearly Matthew talking about being the one left behind and trying to sing, which is to say write, in a beautiful way, such that he will be granted the privilege of rejoining Abby in heaven. So then underneath that, and directly next to this unsigned review of Dickens' Christmas Story, is a poem, a short poem by Polonius. Now, I have already established that Polonius was one of Matthew's pseudonyms, and he writes in the Portland transcript the same day that Poe's poem, The Valentine, comes out, the one that was a riddle. Matthew comes out the exact same day in a different newspaper, because Poe's The Valentine came out actually in a couple different publications, but it came out in Sartain's magazine, I think it was, like 2 or 3 days before. And then like 2 or 3 days after, it comes out in The Flag of Our Union. Well, that same day, Matthew publishes in the transcript the solution to that riddle, see? And he signs it Polonius. Well, here is something by Polonius that's right next to his unsigned essay about Dickens' Christmas Story. And I can't read it because it's too blurry. But it's signed from Westbrook, which back in the day, that's where I am right now in what used to be Westbrook, which is a suburb essentially of Portland. It's a mile or two outside of Portland. So for all I know, I'm actually literally sitting on the same place that Matthew wrote this poem signed Polonius. Probably not. It's probably somewhere. I imagine it's on this side of Westbrook. It's probably within easy carriage distance or even walking distance of Portland, because his second wife, whom he was estranged from at this point, he wanted to visit his children. So he had a place in Portland, and he probably could visit from where I am now to visit the kids in Portland, see? So there's almost no wiggle room here. This is definitely Matthew signing as Polonius. It was definitely Matthew solving Poe's Valentine poem as Polonius. And it was Matthew who caused The Dying Swan to be printed right directly next to the Dickens Review. Okay, now I would read more of these if I could see them, but you get the gist of it. Next time I felt like I was supposed to put in the close-ups, and I didn't do it. I ignored my intuition or Abby's prompting. I don't know which it is, but I didn't do it. Now we're going to get back into the Weekly Museum, and we're going to look at an example that directly pertains to the Raven. This is one that, as of right now, I do not have in my article that's coming up. And I've already written that paper. I just can't publish it yet until It's going to come out in July in Real Paranormal Magazine, and then a month later I'm going to post it on Academia EDU. In 1849, Mathew began publishing some of Abby's stories, plus one essay and two poems, in the Boston Weekly Museum posthumously, like 8 years after she had died. The very first one, called Mary Mahoney, is signed AP with her initials, her maiden initials. Thereafter, they're all signed by the author of Mary Mahoney, which means they're all signed AP. It's a long story. Albert Pike claimed a great many of her poems that were signed with these initials. Apparently, she attended a class that he taught in Newburyport in 1830, and he stole a whole bunch of her poems out of her workbook. Some of them were class assignments, some of them were personal. But he's definitely not the author of these, because, first of all, this author writes in later on, Mathew writes as Abby, as though he's channeling her later on, and makes it clear that it's a woman. Secondly, Albert Pike submits at least one poem to this paper, and he signs with his full name. So Albert Pike has no claim on anything signed AP in the Boston Weekly Museum. The only possibility, if we're going to be skeptical, is that there was a third author whose initials were also AP. But when you look at the specific references that Abby makes to their life together, see, because she makes a lot of very personal references, including in this story. And then you look at her interest in the occult, which shows up throughout this series, because she has palm readers and various things in here. And then you have to have somebody that writes as well as Abby did. And you have to have somebody that has all of her sensibilities and her concern and compassion for the downtrodden and for social reform. You put all of these things together, the likelihood that anybody else with all of those qualities would be in the vicinity to write and publish in the Boston Weekly Museum is almost nil. So Mathew has basically set her in Worcester, Massachusetts, because that's where she writes from. And he has kind of created her as a character, and she submits all of these stories. Now, some of them he has provided a beginning and an ending. Either they weren't finished or they were just plays, I don't know. But only, I think 2 of them he's modified somewhat heavily in terms of giving it sandwiching it into supposed correspondence between an elderly uncle and his niece. This one he has not. This is one of the most sophisticated of the stories. It's called Bobby Lincoln. It's about a town idiot savant, basically, who's kind of a dwarf or a hunchback or something. And he's very simple, but he has a certain wisdom about him, see, and he plays the violin, and he's kind of a favorite, and he befriends this brother and sister who are orphans. They're adopted orphans. They stand in for Abby and Mathew. One of them's called Frank. One of them is, so, I just said that Mathew hated Frank. Well, anyway, she took this character and named him Frank to indicate that it was Mathew. And she calls herself Fanny. And there's a lot of personal references in here, including the fact that whenever Mathew would praise Abby's beauty or praise her, she thought that he was flattering her. That comes in other contexts as well. She didn't have that good a self-image, and she didn't really think she was all that beautiful, which she definitely was. So there's a poem after this, too. I don't know if it relates. Lines given to a friend a day or two before the decease of the writer. Definitely. Okay, so this poem after Bobby Lincoln says given to a friend a day or two before the decease of the writer, and it goes on. It's not something written by Abby. It's not literally written by her. It's something that Mathew, in his grief, ongoing grief, many years after Abby's death, has caused to be placed after her story. This is the last one. So if he's ever going to put a tribute to Abby, it's going to be before or after, or before and after this last story, Bobby Lincoln. And he doesn't disappoint. I'll read a little bit of this poem that comes after, and then we'll go to the one that comes before, which is directly on target for the Raven. When I beneath the cold red earth am sleeping, life's fever o'er, will there for me be any bright eye weeping that I'm no more? Will there be any heart still memory keeping of heretofore? It's not very good poetry. It's there because of the content. When the great winds through leafless forests rushing sad music make, when the swollen streams o'er crag and gully gushing like full hearts break, will there be one whose heart despair is crushing mourn for my sake? When the bright sun upon that spot is shining with purest ray, and the small flowers, their buds and blossoms twining, burst through that clay, will there be one still on that spot repining, lost hopes all day? When no star twinkles with the eye of glory on that low mound, and wintry storms have with their ruins hoary its loneliness crowned, will there be then one versed in miser's story, pacing it round? It may be so, but this is selfish sorrow to ask such meed, a weakness and a wickedness to borrow from hearts that bleed, the wailings of today for what tomorrow shall never need. Lay me then gently in my narrow dwelling, thou gentle heart, and though thy bosom should with grief be swelling, let no tear start. It were vain, for time hath long been knelling, sad one, depart. Anonymous, it's anonymous. Okay, well, Matthew caused that to be placed immediately below the last of Abby's stories that he published for her posthumously. Above this, okay, there we go. Now I can see a little better. This is called the dove, and it has a hand-pointing symbol, and the introduction says, the following lines, says a contemporary, were composed by Miss Townsend of Philadelphia after hearing Edgar A. Poe's Raven read. Her own situation of blindness and entire helplessness is most touchingly alluded to, and the spirit of the two poems is very striking. What she's done is to take the despair of the raven and turn it around and give it the faith of the Christian, this blind girl. And what Matthew is saying with this is that now, 9 years after Abby's death, he has more faith. He no longer feels that physical death trumps over the spirit, which is the way he felt at the time that he wrote the poem, The Raven. So he has printed the poem of someone who has turned it around backwards as a statement of faith. And he has caused it to be placed immediately above Abby's last story, Bobby Lincoln. Now, you could say that Matthew was just doing this to comment on The Raven, which he, knew was written by Edgar Allan Poe, but then we've got all the other clues, including this method of stacking one thing on top of another. And those clues say that Matthew said, I wrote The Raven. Poe is a hopeless imitator who could never have written it. Okay, so you have to look at all the evidence together. You can't just isolate out one thing and give it an interpretation. So I'll just read a little bit of this. 'Twas midnight, solemn, dark, and deep, and vainly I had courted sleep, when worn with pain, with anguish tossed, hope, faith, and patience nearly lost, I heard a sound, a gentle sound, breaking the solemn stillness round, a gentle, soft, and murmuring sound, making the stillness more profound. And it's a dove that's come to her, see, instead of a raven. So I didn't even use that example in my paper because I've got so much evidence. It didn't even make it in. And that's pretty strong clue in itself if you put everything together, So let's read the last two stanzas. Thou movest me strangely, wondrous bird. My soul is strongly, deeply stirred. My heart grown lighter. May I still my mission on the earth fulfill, proving my love to God sincere by doing all my duty here? Shall past omissions be forgiven, and shall the weary rest in heaven? He spread his wings, that radiant dove, and cheerfully answered, God is love. That's the refrain here. God is love, see, instead of nevermore. Then she ends, thanks, heavenly messenger, I cried. Remain that picture still beside, surrounded by the light of truth, compassion meet for sinless youth. Thou blessed type of love and peace, my hope and faith thou'lt still increase. Be ever near me, gentle dove. I know, I feel that God is love. Okay, so that's our examples, the ones that I could readily come up with by searching on keywords through my 2 books. There are more. I know that I've run across quite a few more. It's far beyond chance, you know. And when you read, if you read my paper on Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven, you will see 3, 4, 5 more examples, which are directly on target, which make it very clear what Matthew was trying to say and what his attitude was about Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven. You know, there's no question about it. So what people in denial do when you present them with evidence that strong is they refuse to read it. They disparage it. They call it drivel. They pretend that they've read it because obviously, you know, they have to say that they've read it in order to be able to comment on it. They pronounce it drivel. They say that I haven't proved anything, that it's all conjecture, and they avoid it. They don't actually, you know, read it, not seriously. They don't, you know, really have an honest opinion about it. They just dismiss it and they forget about it and they hope it will go away, you know. And out of hundreds of people, maybe 1 or 2 will actually read it and realize, you know, oh my gosh, this guy's right. Poe didn't write The Raven. It was written by this deeply spiritual person who was in the middle of a terrible faith crisis. It was not a Gothic horror poem at all, ever. Never was. Never will be. And that means that all of the Hollywood movie that was made about how Edgar Allan Poe wrote The Raven, it's BS. The whole thing is wrong, you know, fatally wrong, which is, we're talking, you know, big box office stuff there. All of the scholars, past and present, who have embraced Edgar Allan Poe and embraced The Raven as his poem, the society that's called the Raven Society, they're all fatally flawed, all of them. I can't help it. It's not my fault. It's Poe's fault, you know. You know, if you want to say it's, you know, his childhood that's at fault, you can go there. But it's not Mathew Franklin Whittier's fault. It's not my fault. You know, never shoot the messenger, you know, unless you really want to go into La La Land. Never shoot the messenger, you know. Shoot the guy that should be shot, which is Edgar Allan Poe, or forgive him for his character disorder. He apparently was a sociopath. And we don't know exactly how people get to be sociopaths. I have my own theories having to do with reincarnation, but, you know, maybe he couldn't help it. But the fault is Poe's, not Matthew's and not mine. You know, I'm not making this up. I've got the evidence. So there we have it. And that paper will be published presumably in Real Paranormal Magazine UK, not Real Paranormal Magazine. That's a different outfit. Probably in July. It'll be published in July. Then in August, I will post it on Academia EDU and probably write to maybe 100 people or so this time. And I'll be careful, a little more careful to be sure that I have a couple download sources. And then we'll go from there and see if maybe 1 or 2 people will take it seriously out of that 100. That's about the best I can hope for. Those 1 or 2 people, let's say they're scholars in an English department somewhere, they won't dare say anything because it could cost them their job. They would be ridiculed. They would be laughed out of the park. They would be laughed out of the park by people who refuse to actually read the paper seriously, who are going into denial because they have so much personally invested in Edgar Allan Poe being the author of The Raven. It's a huge scam. That's all I can say. But when you get past that scam, and you go back and look at the real author, and you look at his backstory, and you look at his legacy and who he was, you have something much, much more interesting and much deeper than Edgar Allan Poe, the sociopath, you know? This is the thing about A Christmas Carol and Matthew and Abby's authorship of this story and The Raven and some other ones like Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry that she stole from Matthew.
The real authors are much more interesting. There's a much deeper backstory and more interesting backstory. And they wrote a lot of pieces which are just as good that nobody's ever heard of. So there's a treasure trove of work, poetry and prose by these same authors that nobody's ever heard of. So it's a wonderful discovery. It's not really it's not all destructive. In other words, there's a destructive part of it that has to do with getting the reputation, getting the pieces away from these people who have this world reputation, tearing it from their grasp. There's a lot of destruction involved in that. But there's this beautiful inheritance that comes after that. After the destruction comes the, beauty of Matthew and Abby's work and their lives, the poignancy of their lives, see, that I'm trying to introduce, and I'm particularly trying to preserve, because it deserves to be preserved. Even if I was not Matthew's reincarnation, this legacy deserves to be preserved for the future. I can't do it without breaking the stranglehold that these famous plagiarists have on it. There's no way around it. I don't know any gentle way to do this, because I could gently suggest this for 100 lifetimes and nobody would pay any attention to me. So I have to go in like a bull in the china shop and destroy these things, these claims. And then I have to bring in the truth. I don't know if anybody has any other suggestions. I'm all ears. And, I've been making too many of these entries and people are getting tired of them, I think. The views are going down somewhat. Future views, who knows? So I may not do quite so many of them. I'm still working on that song that I wanted to play in its entirety. I'm still not to the point where I really can comfortably play it all the way through. So I will see you whenever I do the next entry.